Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is the Office of Consumer Credit Commissioner's stakeholder meeting to discuss licensing and administration rules to implement sunset legislation. My name is Matt Nance. I'm the OCCC's Deputy General Counsel, and I'm joined by several members of the OCCC staff, including our Commissioner, Leslie Pettyjohn, Assistant General Counsel, Lori Hobbs, Director of Licensing, Moran Diamond, Manager of Consumer Assistance, Alfredo Hernandez, our legal assistant, Ginger Harmon, and our compliance coordinator, Kimberly Dio. And I'd like to turn things over to Commissioner Pettyjohn to make a couple opening remarks.
First of all, I would like to say welcome to everyone that's here with us in the Finance Commission building, and also to those on the webinar. We very much appreciate you being here today, appreciate your participation in this process. Your participation is vital in helping us to produce the best set of rules that we need to implement legislation. As I think you know from reading the notice, that this draft that we're working on presently for pre-comment is a draft to implement our sunset legislation, which yesterday was finalized through the legislative process and headed to the governor still, but the House concurred in the Senate amendments late yesterday, so we're pleased that we've sort of moved past that hurdle and moving forward with the agency sunset bill, and Matt will probably say a few things more about that. But thank you to all of you that certainly participated in that process. We learned a lot from that process, and we're grateful to have that behind us and to move ahead with the new task and challenges that we have to implement that legislation. And so this is the first step. And so again, thank you for your feedback is important, and we certainly wholeheartedly and open-mindedly, solicit your feedback and process participation in this process. With that, turn it back to Matt.
So, like the Commissioner said, I want to thank everyone for coming to our meeting as well as listening online. Input from stakeholders is a really important part of the rulemaking process that helps us make sure we can produce the best rules possible. At the side of the room, we have copies of our stakeholder meeting notice and pre-comment draft that we had posted last week. Those are the draft rules that we'll be discussing. And a copy of the pre-comment draft is also available on the OCCC's webpage for recent and upcoming rules. We're holding this meeting on GoToWebinar. Some of you might be listening on phones, some may be watching on computers, some may be doing both. For those of you watching on your computer, there's a window where you can submit questions. If you have technical questions about using the webinar, you can type them in there, and Ginger will try to answer those. If you're listening online and have comments on the notice itself, go ahead and type those in at any time, and I'll be getting to those as well. And if you're on a computer with a mic, there's a function allowing you to raise your hand, and then we could let you make a comment verbally. For those of you here in person, we have a table with a mic. You can come up and share comments if you'd like. If you have shorter comments or questions, you can share them from your seat, town hall style. But keep in mind that if you do that, I will need to repeat the question so those listening online can hear it. And with that, I want to briefly lay out what's in the pre-comment draft, and then we'll turn it over to you to provide your comments. So generally, these rules are based on the OCCC's sunset legislation. Sunset is a process that all Texas state agencies go through periodically, usually every 12 years. As part of the sunset process, the Texas Sunset Advisory Commission did a review of our agency, made recommendations to the legislature about how to ensure we operate effectively, and the legislature has passed a bill incorporating those recommendations. As the Commissioner said yesterday, the House has approved the Senate's amendments, so that bill will be sent to the governor. Assuming the governor signs it, the bill will go into effect on September 1st, 2019. The Sunset Bill amends various provisions throughout the Finance Code relating to the industries that the OCCC regulates. And in looking at those changes, we saw there were some issues that are particular to pawn shops and other issues that were across the board for all of the other regulated industries. We have decided to proceed for now with two rule actions, one that would be particularly focused on the pawn shops, which we had a meeting on this morning, and another rule action that would cover the across-the-board changes for the other regulated industries. So there are three main across-the-board sunset issues that we'll be addressing today with this rule action. First, the Sunset Bill, HB 1442, authorizes the Finance Commission to set license and registration terms for periods up to 2 years. And the bill does this by amending each chapter of the Finance Code where the OCCC issues a license or registration and allows the Finance Commission to set the term and expiration date for each of those licenses and registrations. This is based on a sunset recommendation to make sure the agency has some flexibility in setting license and registration terms. Second, the bill simplifies Section 14062 of the Finance Code dealing with complaints. This change is connected to some recommendations from Sunset staff's report, where Sunset recommends that our complaint rules to describe the phases of the complaint process. And third, the bill amends provisions about appeals of contested cases to state that those appeals are governed by the Texas Administrative Procedure Act, where an appeal goes first to an administrative law judge and then to a district court. The bill removes some provisions that talked about appeals to our oversight body, the Finance Commission. Sunset recommended this so that all appeals would be handled through a standard common practice for appealing agency decisions. So that's kind of the rundown of the main issues from the Sunset Bill. The rule amendments that we're proposing in this pre-comment draft address these three issues. The bulk of the rule amendments in this draft are there to clarify license terms, the renewal process, and the expiration date for each license and registration. In this draft, we're currently maintaining the system where licenses and registrations are renewed annually, although we're interested in input on that, as I'll explain in a minute. Second, we're proposing to repeal and replace our complaint processing rule, Section 82.4. to identify the phases of the complaint process based on Sunset's recommendations. And third, we're proposing to amend Section 84309 to specify contested case procedures for appealing the denial of a debt cancellation agreement. As far as the expiration dates go, this slide shows the proposed expiration dates for 8 of our regulated industries: the residential mortgage loan originators, regulated lenders, credit access businesses, craft and precious metal dealers, registered creditors, refund anticipation loan facilitators, debt management, and property tax lenders. For these, we currently plan to maintain the same general renewal periods and expiration dates with some minor adjustments for a couple of the registrations, so that each of these expiration dates falls at the end of a month. So if you kind of go to these sections, you'll see we're trying to standardize each of these rules listed here, so they have kind of a standard structure describing you know, that these licenses and registrations have an annual term, specifying the renewal process, the date on which the license or registration expires, and if the statute allows any kind of reinstatement or late renewal, kind of how that process works. Make sure it's standardized across the board. For our motor vehicle sales finance licensees, we're considering a couple different approaches. Those currently have a renewal period in July with an expiration date of July 31st. And we're considering whether to maintain that date or move it to October 31st to better align with the agency's fiscal year. If we did move to an October 31st expiration, we try to make sure to make it so that any motor vehicle licensees who renew this summer before these rules go into effect wouldn't have to renew again until 2020. Another thing we're considering, if we move the date to October 31st, one thing we're considering would be splitting the motor vehicle licensees into 2 groups, one of which would renew in July 2020, and the other of which would renew in October 2020. And then in 2021, the groups would be aligned back with each other and be renewing in October of 2021. So both groups would renew this July of 2019 for 2020, one group would renew in July, the other would renew in October, and then in 2021, everyone's aligned and renewing in October. So those are kind of the things we're considering for that licensee group. As far as the timeline for these rules, oh, I'm sorry, this says pawnshop rules. It should be the licensing and administration rules. May 29th is the period where we'll be accepting informal pre-comments. On June 21st, there's a Finance Commission meeting where we plan to submit the proposed rules to the Finance Commission for publication for comment. During the month of July, there would be an official comment period. At the Finance Commission's meeting on August 16th, that's when we would schedule adoption of the rules at the Finance Commission meeting. September 1st, the Sunset Bill would go into effect, and then early to mid-September, the rules would be effective. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to you to see what comments you may have. We're particularly interested in costs, if there are any, that licensees may experience as a result of these. What do you think about maintaining the annual renewal? At some point in the future, do you have any thoughts about moving to something other than annual renewal, like 2-year renewal? Do you have any thoughts about maintaining or changing the current expiration dates, especially for motor vehicle? Are there thoughts about the move to an October date? Again, we have a table if you'd like to come up to speak, or if you'd like to make a comment from your seat, I can repeat that for those listening to the webinar. Yeah, Karen.
I'm just going to thank you.
Okay.
Has there been any considerations with respect to having half of the motor vehicle sales plans licenses renew 1 year and the other half renew another year, so that you're on a 2-year rotation and you don't have all of them renewing at the same time, so that maybe it's not quite such a big load to renew?
Okay, so the question was, have we considered having half of the motor vehicle licensees renew 1 year and the other half another year, so that each licensee is on a 2-year cycle?
That's one of the issues that we're seeking feedback on. The feedback we have gotten in the past on 2-year license renewals is mixed. Some folks support it and some folks don't support it. For some, they feel like the burden of a 2-year license fee is greater, that they'd rather split that out and do it annually. We're certainly actively soliciting information on that because we're trying to discern what's the best way to approach that. So we'd be very much interested in detailed feedback about that issue and how the industry feels about that. Big issue.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I agree with that as far as the load on also Consumer Credit Commission, and I'll say anecdotally, the information that we've gotten from our members at this point is that they would support 2-year renewal. We haven't sent out any formal survey yet, but anecdotally, the Department of Motor Vehicle does, and seems to work pretty well as far as the workload, and I think it's still moving very on the industry as well. I do understand cost factor, but I don't know that it's significant enough to outweigh the other benefits.
Okay, so I'll repeat that. Jeff was expressing support for a 2-year system to lighten the burden on licensees like the Department of Motor Vehicles.
I'll go up here so people can hear.
All right.
Carl Gallant for the Texas Consumer Finance Association. On the renewal period question, the members I've been able to speak with of the association are really ambivalent about it. I mean, I think they prefer to stay on an annual renewal period for the regulated lenders. No strong position one way or the other on it. We discussed whether there could be any kind of administrative cost savings for some larger operations of only having to do it every 2 years, but we really didn't get much feedback on it. So at this point, no strong position to change the current process. On we do have some concerns in other areas, primarily in the consumer complaint process, in the new rule there. And it's around the definition of complaint. And sunset legislation suggests that the commission needs to develop a system for the prompt and efficient administration of complaints or response to complaints. But it uses the word complaint, and so the question is, what is a complaint? And the current definition references or a communication that alleges misconduct or a violation of law, and I think that makes sense. But then it goes on and says, or requests assistance from the OCCC regarding a transaction. And this is where some licensees are a little concerned and think that's vague and could increase the burden on both the commission and on licensees having to respond to mere inquiries about a contract, for instance, or something that does not allege misconduct or a violation of law, and maybe expands this complaint process beyond what truly is a complaint. So there could be added costs associated with responding to those types of complaints, because there now is a formal response requirement on behalf of licensees. So we've heard our members express concern about that and a desire to either clarify that when assistance is requested about a transaction, that it's in the context of allegations of misconduct or violations of the law. But mere sort of inquiries, which is another defined term here, mere inquiries about a transaction shouldn't be considered a complaint. So we'll likely provide comments on that point, and I wanted to express those here and hear feedback on what your thinking is on that latter language on assistance with transactions, where that comes from.
Comments on that?
Yeah, I would just say that currently, I understand our consumer assistance department will get questions requesting help with communicating with a respondent or a licensee that might be categorized as a complaint. Alfredo, do you have any thoughts or examples of that?
So we can get instances where consumers are trying to communicate with our licensees, and they're failing to communicate with them, failing to provide them an explanation on what the transaction was that they got themselves into. And so part of what we do is kind of review those documents and try to explain that on behalf of the licensee to the consumer. So that could be an example of where maybe it's not you could think maybe it's not a complaint, kind of an inquiry, but from my perspective, the consumer's contacting us to try to explain the transaction, the licensee could do themselves as well. So I'm very, very, very curious to hear what your comments would be when we get them to read about what this idea of vagueness would be, what you fear would be a type of complaint we get that would not constitute a complaint.
I'm sorry, Alfredo. If you could get closer to the mic or just project
Speak
a little
up.
more.
Sorry. So I guess that's it.
Well, each transaction, each promissory note, for instance, in a regulated lender context, requires a disclosure statement, contact information. Any questions about this promissory note, you may contact the Office of Consumer Credit Commission, provides contact information. So sometimes I could envision a scenario where a borrower would like to call the commissioner, not because maybe they don't understand something in the contract, and so instead of calling the lender, they call the commissioner. And is that a complaint necessarily? Should it involve the lender? I guess that's a separate question. I mean, maybe there's a different type of inquiry here that needs to involve, or maybe it still ought to be referred to the lender. Hey, you had a customer who's asking about this. But I think we're concerned that if something is characterized as a complaint, that it requires a higher burden of responsiveness, and that type of I don't know how frequently this happens, I guess, in your office, but we are worried about being bombarded with inquiries that are not really complaints. any call from a customer, is that going to be considered a complaint? And I suppose they all relate to a transaction.
Right.
Text.
Okay, well, we can, I guess, consider that input and, yeah, figure out how to proceed with this definition and, yeah, maybe see whether we want to change or maintain that based on review of that input. So thank you.
One other item on, again, in the complaint process, let me find the actual sentence. Somewhere in here, there's a statement that your office is going to endeavor to keep complainants' information confidential. And understand that desire. The problem, of course, on the licensee side, and the problem, having to process and respond to complaints is the licensees have to know the identity of the customer and the account and be able to respond to that. And so I'm assuming the identity and information necessary to respond will be provided to licensees. That's not going to remain confidential. Is that correct?
I'll jump in here. We're in a little bit between a rock and a hard place on this kind of issue because the Sunset Commission's best practices demand that we try to keep the complainant's identity as effort to protect that, or whatever we said, a good faith effort to protect that. We're supposed to protect that identity where possible. But in a financial transaction, the only way you can get information related to an account is you're going to have to provide the information related to the account. So we recognize that it's a really difficult line to kind of balance here because if we are really, unless it's sort of I don't want that, I don't want to say who I am, but I just have this general complaint about X. Okay, well, we'll take that information and deal with it however we need to deal with it. And in that situation, we could protect that person's identity. But if they say, my account, I got overcharged for X, Y, and Z, or I went to pay off my loan and this was the payoff and I think that's wrong, and the only way we'll be able to verify that is obviously to communicate that information because you can't get it otherwise. So we recognize that the difficulty of this particular provision, but we feel like we need to leave it in because it fits the Sunset model. I don't know if anybody's got any other comments on that, but.
Yeah, the other piece is kind of public information, right?
Yeah.
So unless a specific statutory exception applies, the information we get is public information under the public information laws. So again, that's kind of another to the extent possible side of things.
Although typically when we get requests for those, there's either they get the consumer's identifying information and not any financial information, or they get financial information and no consumer identifying information. So we can usually kind of separate that.
There is some kind of right of privacy exceptions, but not the whole. That doesn't cover all parts of the complaint.
Can I just interject one more time? I know we're all in the same room, and so we have kind of a conversational thing happening here, but please remember that other people are trying to listen and keep your voice maybe raised. I think we're having a tendency to trail off, and folks online are having a hard time hearing. So don't feel like you're shouting at us. You kind of need to, so the other folks can hear.
This is Carl Gallant again, and I appreciate that and the issue you're facing there. I'll only comment further that the ability of licensees to respond and to have an effective complaint process and response process hinges on the information that the licensee is able to obtain from the commission.
Certainly.
Yeah.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks,
Carl. Okay, we have some questions through the webinar. So what are those?
So the first one is, on the automotive dealers, why not renew when our license renews?
Okay, so the question was, on the automotive dealers, why not renew when our license renews?
Exactly.
And I'm not sure that I understand the question. Again, the idea is that this sunset bill would go into effect on September 1st, which means that over the summer, we have a renewal date coming up this summer, that's not going to be affected by the sunset bill. So that 2019 renewal date will happen in July. Starting September 1st, the Finance Commission would have the ability to set that period, and the different ideas we're talking about in the rules would be either to maintain the current July renewal date, or to move that to October 31st. And then if we moved it to October 31st, then the question would be, when is everyone going to renew in 2020? And should we split the licensees into two groups, one of whom would renew in July and one who would renew in October?
Man, I could translate.
Thank you. Please do, Karen.
I think probably what they're asking is, why can't the OCC motor vehicle sales finance license be renewal at the same time as the DMV?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Karen offered that the asker might be asking if they could renew at the same time as the DMV license. We'd welcome some comments if that's the recommendation.
We currently, this is Marianne, Director of Licensing. We don't currently in our system have a field for when their DMV license was obtained. Okay. So that's one thing. But yeah, detailed feedback on that would certainly be welcome.
Okay.
We have somebody that would like to ask a question.
Okay, so someone has raised their hand, so we can go ahead and unmute them so that they can ask their question through the phone system.
This is Arlette Reese.
Okay. Okay, you can go ahead and ask your question. Hello?
Ms. Reese?
Okay.
She's asked a couple questions. Maybe mute her again and read her questions.
Read the type questions? Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so her first question is, if we want the 2-year license renewal for dealers, can we apply as early as July?
Okay, so the question was if we want a 2-year license for dealers, can we apply as early as July? And the answer would be not yet. Again, the sunset bill doesn't go into effect until September 1st, and these rules wouldn't go into effect until the earliest toward the beginning of September. So, for this year, we are looking at renewal for a 1-year term in July. That might get adjusted for certain licensees and last till next October, but any 2-year renewal would probably happen a bit later, while we kind of gather input and assess the logistics of how that would work.
And deal with system changes and those kind of things as well.
Yeah.
So I want to clarify too that we're seeking feedback on the pros of a 2-year cycle, but it would not require an application to move to a 2-year cycle. It would be an overall change, and that's why we're seeking feedback on that.
Yeah. Any other webinar questions?
I have another registrant who raised his hand.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and unmute him. Yeah, he put his hand down.
Okay. Never mind.
I think Bill Daniel may be ready.
Okay. Did anyone else have something? Bill? Okay.
Yes, good afternoon, William Daniel. Thank you for the opportunity to make a few comments.
Excuse me, sir. I'm just going to angle the mic.
Okay, can you hear now?
Okay, I think that's fair.
And mine will be very brief. First of all, on the licensing, whenever it's done, my suggestion would be that should give notice more than once, because the people who do these things tend to have, in my experience, tend to have 50 states to deal with, and they get they're very process driven.
Yeah.
And in Texas, we do this day, and it's going to take a while to adjust to it. We can tell probably the next several years.
Sure.
On the question on the registered creditors, unlike the licensing, there's a lot of provision for notice if they fail to register. The proposal just got applied for that. It probably be a good idea. First of all, you want them to stay registered and pay the registration fee and stay with you. But the other thing is, again, because there tends to be confusion. I have to, I want to take care of Texas. They did the 348, they had another 345. It'd be helpful to remind them that it's due. I really had not talked to my partner, Carl, a lot, but actually two of his comments, I have a similar comment. First of all, on complaint, where there's something that's just an inquiry and not really a complaint, it'd be helpful not to badge it as a complaint, because if the company has to report to CFPB or anybody else the number of complaints they've had, they want it to be an accurate number, and obviously not to report as complaints those that really are not complaints. They were simply inquiries or clarifications. Likewise, on our minds are thinking the same on some of this. The folks that I usually represent are not to give an intelligent response to a complaint. They really need to know the name and the account number, at least enough to identify it. And I've had, for example, I recall one very specifically where a person had two contracts that they were trying to complain about and kept getting mixed up which ones their comments went with. And it turned out the agency determined there was no violation on either. But it was partly sorting out the facts to give an intelligent response so that the agency could explain it to them. And then one on, this is page 4, and it talks about a complainant who disagrees with disposition of the complaint may appeal and send a written request, which will then be considered by a senior member of the staff, all of which is fine. It would be very helpful to the company involved to know that an appeal has been made for a couple of reasons. First of all, the appeal might provide some further information that they didn't have earlier, so that now they can give a more complete response. Or now it's, oh, that's not what they were asking about. They're asking about this. Secondly, from the company's point of view, they'll think, okay, we got back, the complaint was resolved, there was no violation, and they resume activity. And if it was something involving collection, they resume collecting. Not that they couldn't, but if they knew there were an appeal pending, they might say, okay, let's put a further hold on that till at least we respond and hear what the agency's response is. And I believe those are all the comments. Any questions?
Yes. Going back to your comment on registered creditors and the notice, were you talking about a cancellation notice or?
No, the renewal notice, such as the motor for the 348 license, there's a provision.
Okay.
Here. Basically, a reminder being sent by the agency.
Okay. Yeah. So we do send emails periodically throughout the registered creditor renewal period to those who have not renewed their registration yet. But yeah, I took a note on that.
Yeah, I noticed it wasn't in the rule.
Right.
I just wanted to see if that was delivered or not.
Okay.
And to the extent,
Probably as a matter of practice, we do that, but statute doesn't have the same requirement that the other statutes do. That's really a statutory kind of statutory language.
For the licenses, the finance code talks about the written notice of delinquency and the date of expiration being connected to that. whereas for the registrations, it doesn't have that same specification. But yeah, as in practice, we do have information on our website about that, and communicate through the contact information we have on file in our licensing and registration system.
And again, I'm thinking of the clerk, got all these dates,
Sure.
process driven, and I saw one once on the report that has to be given for lease vehicles, in order for the lessees not to, vehicles not to be taxed. There are two different requirements that occur in the same month. Got them confused.
Okay.
Thought it was done. It was absolutely heartsick when found out that the entire base of lessees were now going to have to tax those vehicles.
Yeah.
Just through administrative oversight.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have a couple more questions online.
Okay.
Okay, the first one is, how would we be notified if the 2 years goes into effect?
So the question is, how would we be notified if the 2 years go into effect?
That would probably be a function of the licensing department, and we would again send out numerous emails. Yeah, we've kind of been talking about methods of communication on this, but yeah, we would certainly want to over-communicate that rather than under-communicate that.
Yeah. And before we even got there, there would be rule amendments describing the 2-year period. Again, what the Sunset Bill says is that the Finance Commission, our oversight body, by rule, may set the licensing period up to 2 years. So, we'd have a rule draft that would be published for comment and posted on our website in the rules section with an official comment period and all of that kind of thing before a 2-year period went into effect. Any other webinar questions?
As it is, I was going to say, as it is right now, we're talking about a potential 15-month cycle moving to October.
Right.
2020, and during 2020, yeah.
Okay, here's our next question. First license should be for 1 year, and any renewal should be every 2 years. My question is, will 2-year licenses cost less as there will be less paperwork involved?
Okay, so the question was, will the 2-year license cost less because there will be less paperwork involved? Commissioner, do you have any thoughts?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, it's premature for us to answer that question. We haven't performed the analysis of that. Most of the costs associated with the supervision of an industry is not heavily weighted in the licensing function. While it is somewhat of an administrative burden, it's pretty efficient, especially with an online process. So there's not a lot of costs associated with the renewal process, but of course there's some. But we work very hard to try to make sure that we are proper stewards of the funds, and that we try to reduce costs wherever we can. We've had a pretty good track record of offering some discounts in some industries over the past number of years. We would continue to approach that strategy. Moving to some 2-year cycles makes that a little more challenging for some budgetary reasons, but we'll evaluate all of that at the appropriate time. If we get enough information and feedback that suggests it's worth pursuing that type of arrangement. And so that data and the analysis will be available at the time we get there.
Are there any other webinar questions? Okay.
Okay, the next question is, when do registered lenders have to renew?
Okay, so the question was, when do registered lenders have to renew? So there are two different groups. There's the groups we call the regulated lenders. Those are our licensees under Chapter 342 of the Texas Finance Code. They today under our current statute and rules, have a renewal period in December with or I guess November and December, with expiration on December 31st. Under these proposed rules, we keep that the same. For the registered creditors who are, a registrant under Chapter 345 of the Texas Finance Code, I guess they...
Or 347.
Or 347, the manufactured housing registrant. They currently have a period in, I guess, October, November.
With an expiration very beginning of December.
Yeah.
So the time frame of those renewals doesn't really change with this expiration date change.
Right.
It's still the same time frame, October, November.
Yeah.
September, October, November, really.
Right. So this draft would not change really the current practice on those.
So there's just one more comment. It says, "Thank you for your work on our behalf."
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
And that's all I got.
Okay. Do we have any folks in the room? Any other questions, comments, concerns? Okay. I've been told it's good to wait like 30 seconds or so after asking just to see if anyone comes up with something. So I'll give you guys a few more seconds before we wrap up. Okay, well, again, I want to thank everyone. I think we got some really good input from both our folks here in person and through the webinar. Rule updates are available on our website, on our recent and upcoming rules page, and we will be posting the audio of the meeting. We are accepting written informal pre-comments in these rules until 5 p.m. on May 29th. Please email those to Lori at rule.comments@occc.texas.gov, which is our email address for rule comments. And thank you all for attending.